Imagine a giant collapsing under its own weight. A nation that once held the world in its grip, reduced to ruins in the blink of an eye. The Soviet Union's sudden disintegration in 1991 was more than a geopolitical earthquake. It was the collapse of a dream. From these ashes, a man named Vladimir Putin emerged, rising to power and reshaping Russia into a global force once more. But how did a superpower fail so spectacularly? How did Putin manage to breathe life into a nation that had lost everything? This is a story of Russia's dramatic fall and rise. It's December 25, 1991. Mikhail Gorbachev, the last leader of the Soviet Union, appears on television to announce his resignation. As the Soviet flag is lowered for the last time, millions of Russians stare at their screens in disbelief. An empire built over 7 decades had crumbled overnight. Jobs disappeared, food became scarce, and the once feared Russian military seemed a shell of its former self. Amid this chaos, a young KGB officer named Vladimir Putin was watching closely, nursing a quiet ambition. Little did anyone know, this man would one day rebuild Russia's place on the world stage. The fall of the Soviet Union, a slow unraveling. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 was the culmination of decades of internal contradictions, economic stagnation, and political unrest. While the USSR had projected itself as a beacon of socialist ideals, the reality was far more complex. Founded on Marxist-Leninist principles, the Soviet state controlled every aspect of its citizens' lives, from the economy to political expression. The rigid system that promised to elevate the working class instead became a bureaucratic machine that stifled innovation, rewarded corruption, and eroded public trust. By the 1980s, the Soviet Union was crumbling under the weight of its own inefficiencies. Centralized economic planning, which worked reasonably well in the early decades, became increasingly obsolete in a world moving toward globalization and market-based economies. Soviet industries were inefficient, and consumer goods were often scarce. Economic stagnation became the norm, and shortages of food, clothing, and essential services undermined the Soviet promise of prosperity. Internationally, the Soviet Union found itself mired in a costly Cold War, and nowhere was this more evident than in Afghanistan. The 1979 invasion of Afghanistan, intended to shore up a friendly socialist regime, turned into a military disaster. The war drained the Soviet economy and demoralized both its military and civilian population. It also exposed deep ideological divisions within the Soviet leadership about how to handle the increasing challenges facing the state. Enter Mikhail Gorbachev, the last leader of the Soviet Union. His twin policies of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, were meant to reform the USSR from within. Glasnost allowed greater freedom of speech and transparency, but it also unleashed a flood of pent-up criticism. Citizens, long silenced, began to openly express their frustrations with the government. Meanwhile, perestroika aimed to decentralize economic control, allowing for some market reforms. But instead of revitalizing the economy, it plunged the country into greater disarray. As these internal tensions grew, so did nationalist movements within the Soviet republics. The Baltic states, Ukraine, and others demanded independence, citing economic struggles and cultural suppression. The Soviet Union, which once controlled vast swaths of Eastern Europe and Central Asia, began to splinter along ethnic and national lines. The final nail in the coffin came with the August 1991 coup attempt by hardline communists. The failed coup weakened the central government and accelerated the dissolution of the Soviet Union. By December 1991, the Soviet flag was lowered for the last time, replaced by the Russian tricolor. 15 new nations emerged from the wreckage, and Russia itself was left in chaos, grappling with the sudden loss of its superpower status and the collapse of its once mighty economy. The rise of Vladimir Putin, from unknown to power. In the aftermath of the Soviet Union's collapse, Russia entered a period of profound instability. Boris Yeltsin, the first president of the Russian Federation, presided over a country in chaos. The economy was in free fall, and hyperinflation wiped out savings. Rampant corruption took hold as oligarchs seized control of key industries, while ordinary citizens struggled to survive. It was during this turbulent time that an unknown figure, Vladimir Putin, began his rise to power. Putin's background is rooted in the KGB, the Soviet Union's feared intelligence agency. He served in East Germany during the Cold War, witnessing the unraveling of the Eastern Bloc firsthand. By the time he returned to Russia in the early 1990s, the Soviet Union had collapsed, and the KGB had disbanded. Putin initially entered politics in St. Petersburg, where he worked closely with Anatoly Sobchak, a prominent reformist mayor. His reputation as a pragmatic and effective administrator earned him attention from the political elite. Putin's ascent was rapid. By 1999, he was appointed prime minister by President Yeltsin, a decision that would change the trajectory of Russian history. Yeltsin was increasingly seen as a weak and ineffective leader, plagued by health problems and allegations of corruption. In a surprise move, Yeltsin resigned on December 31, 1999, handing the presidency to Putin, a little-known politician who would soon become one of the most powerful figures in the world. Putin's first major challenge came in the form of the Second Chechen War. The conflict in Chechnya had been a humiliating defeat for Russia under Yeltsin, with the military suffering heavy losses. But Putin approached the war with a decisive ruthlessness. He launched a brutal campaign to crush the Chechen insurgency, using the full force of the Russian military. By 2000, Russian forces had retaken control of Chechnya, and Putin's strongman image was solidified. The war, though brutal, was popular with many Russians, who saw it as a necessary step to restore order after 50 years of chaos. Putin's consolidation of power was swift. He moved quickly to centralize authority, reining in the oligarchs who had grown powerful under Yeltsin. Some were imprisoned or exiled, while others were co-opted into Putin's inner circle. At the same time, Putin began to tighten control over the media, ensuring that the major television networks were either state-controlled or loyal to his government. This allowed him to craft a carefully curated public image, one of strength, stability, and patriotism. By the early 2000s, Putin had become immensely popular, hailed as a leader who had brought Russia back from the brink of collapse. His image as a decisive leader was further reinforced by his handling of international crises, including his firm stance against NATO expansion and the West. To many Russians, Putin represented a return to greatness, a leader who had restored national pride and order, rebuilding Russia. Putin's vision and strategy. Vladimir Putin's rise to power marked the beginning of a new era for Russia. After a decade of chaos and decline in the 1990s, Putin set out to rebuild the country both economically and militarily, with a focus on restoring national pride and positioning Russia as a global power once again. His strategy combined economic reforms, the reassertion of state control over key industries, and an aggressive foreign policy aimed at reestablishing Russia's influence on the world stage. One of Putin's first moves was to tackle the country's economy, which had been devastated by the transition from a planned economy to a market-based system. In the 1990s, Russia's economy was characterized by hyperinflation, unemployment, and rampant corruption. Oligarchs had taken control of major industries, and wealth inequality was extreme. Under Putin, the state reasserted control over critical sectors, particularly oil and gas, which became the backbone of Russia's economic recovery. The rising global oil prices in the early 2000s played a significant role in Russia's economic revival. Putin capitalized on this windfall, using revenue from oil and gas exports to stabilize the economy and rebuild the country's infrastructure. He also focused on reducing the influence of the oligarchs who had become immensely powerful during the Yeltsin years. High-profile figures like Mikhail Khodorkovsky were targeted, with Khodorkovsky being arrested and his oil company, Yukos, being seized by the state. While this was framed as a crackdown on corruption, it also served to consolidate Putin's power by removing political opponents. Alongside economic stabilization, Putin worked to rebuild Russia's military. Russia's military resurgence became a key part of Putin's strategy for reasserting the country's influence on the global stage. Foreign policy was another area where Putin sought to restore Russia's power. He pursued a strategy of challenging Western dominance, particularly that of the United States and NATO. This was most evident in Russia's 2008 war with Georgia and the 2014 annexation of Crimea. Both actions were condemned by the West, but domestically, they were seen as victories that restored Russian pride and showcased the country's military strength. These moves allowed Putin to position Russia as a resurgent power, willing to stand up to Western hegemony. Putin's vision for Russia also included the promotion of a distinct Russian identity, one rooted in traditional values and Orthodox Christianity. He positioned himself as a defender of conservative social values, in contrast to what he portrayed as the moral decay of the West. This narrative resonated with many Russians, particularly outside the major cities, who felt alienated by the rapid social and economic changes of the 1990s. Under Putin, Russia transformed from a country on the brink of collapse into a resurgent power. However, this transformation came at a cost. While Putin succeeded in stabilizing the economy and restoring national pride, his methods often involved authoritarian tactics, including the suppression of political opposition, the centralization of power, and the curtailing of democratic freedoms. Challenges and criticisms: the dark side of Putin's Russia. While Vladimir Putin is credited with stabilizing Russia and restoring its global influence, his leadership has also been marked by significant challenges and widespread criticism. Many argue that the gains made under Putin have come at the expense of democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. As Putin consolidated power, he increasingly moved towards authoritarianism, stifling political dissent and tightening control over both the media and the economy. One of the most persistent criticisms of Putin's Russia is the country's endemic corruption. While Putin initially cracked down on the oligarchs of the Yeltsin era, he also built a new elite loyal to his regime. Many of Putin's close associates, often referred to as cronies, have become incredibly wealthy through their connections to the government, receiving lucrative state contracts and gaining control of key industries. Transparency International consistently ranks Russia as one of the most corrupt major economies in the world, with corruption permeating all levels of society, from the highest echelons of power to local governance. Political opposition under Putin has been systematically weakened. Key political opponents, such as Alexei Navalny, have faced imprisonment, harassment, and even assassination attempts. Navalny, one of Putin's most prominent critics, was poisoned in 2020 with a Soviet-era nerve agent, a move widely believed to have been orchestrated by the Russian state. High-profile assassinations, such as the killing of journalist Anna Politkovskaya in 2006 and opposition politician Boris Nemtsov in 2015, have further underscored the dangerous climate for dissent in Putin's Russia. In addition to suppressing political opposition, Putin has also restricted media reform. The Russian state controls most major television networks, which are used to promote a pro-government narrative. Independent media outlets have been shut down or co-opted, and journalists who attempt to investigate government corruption or criticize Putin often face intimidation or violence. Russia is consistently ranked as one of the most dangerous countries for journalists, with numerous reporters killed or attacked during Putin's tenure. On the international stage, Putin's foreign policy has also attracted significant criticism. Putin's aggressive foreign policy, including Russia's involvement in the Syrian civil war and its interference in foreign elections, has further isolated Russia on the global stage and deepened tensions with the West. Human rights abuses have also been a hallmark of Putin's rule. The Russian government has cracked down on LGBTQ+ rights, passing laws that ban gay propaganda and encourage discrimination against sexual minorities. Religious and ethnic minorities, particularly in regions like Chechnya, have faced persecution and repression. Russia's legal system, under Putin, has increasingly been used as a tool of political repression, with courts often serving as rubber stamps for the government's agenda. Despite these challenges, Putin remains popular with a significant portion of the Russian population, particularly outside the major urban centers. For many, he represents stability and strength in a world that seems increasingly uncertain. However, as Russia faces ongoing economic challenges, international isolation, and growing unrest, questions about the sustainability of Putin's leadership are becoming more urgent. The story of Russia's fall and rise, from the collapse of the Soviet Union to Putin's two-decade reign, is one of transformation and resilience. Putin's leadership has undoubtedly restored Russia's place as a major global power, but it has come at the cost of democracy and human rights. As Putin faces new challenges, ranging from economic instability to growing opposition at home, the future of Russia remains uncertain.